Welcome to this brief introduction to clinical practice guidelines. In this video, our objectives are to define clinical practice guidelines, demonstrate techniques for finding clinical practice guidelines, and briefly appraise an example of a clinical practice guideline. The most commonly used definition for clinical practice guidelines comes from a report authored by the Institute of Medicine in 2011. They define clinical practice guidelines as statements that include recommendations intended to optimize patient care that are informed by a systematic review of the evidence and an assessment of the benefits and harms of alternative care options. In this diagram, the hallmarks of a clinical practice guideline are illustrated in more detail. Starting at the top, clinical practice guidelines are usually authored by large, multidisciplinary groups who start by doing a systematic review of the available evidence. While gathering evidence, the groups will also consider patient values and preferences and make sure to fully explore the benefits versus harms of all the care options. Once they have assessed the evidence, they will rate the quality of evidence and make graded patient care recommendations. Often the authors will also make some sort of statement about how long the guideline can be considered current or when it will be updated in the future. Searching for clinical practice guidelines is fairly straightforward. In this video, I will demonstrate 3 techniques in UpToDate, DynaMed, and a general web search. Let's start in UpToDate. To get to UpToDate at Frontier, you will first go to the library's homepage at library.frontier.edu. Scroll down to the Clinical Resources section and click on UpToDate. UpToDate has a very simple interface with one search box. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to look for a clinical practice guideline related to lung cancer screening. Once I've done my search, I click on the title of the topic that matches my search the best. The UpToDate authors and editors review the literature on a regular basis and then put together these summaries to assist practicing clinicians at the point of care. That is why resources like UpToDate and DynaMed are referred to as point-of-care resources. To see a listing of guidelines related to a topic in UpToDate, use the table of contents on the left-hand side of the screen and scroll down to the section titled Society Guideline Links. UpToDate will provide a list of known guidelines related to the topic, separated by world region. Not every single listing will be a full-scale clinical practice guideline, but by using your knowledge on the elements of clinical practice guidelines, as illustrated earlier in the video, you can assess each link accordingly. You can do the exact same type of search in DynaMed. From the library's homepage, click on DynaMed under Clinical Resources. Repeat your search, and then choose a topic that matches. Very similar to UpToDate, use the table of contents on the left-hand side and scroll down to the section titled Guidelines and Resources. The guideline listing in DynaMed is also separated by world region, and it is very likely that many of the same resources will be included in both DynaMed and UpToDate. The last search technique is simply a web search. Many of the multidisciplinary groups that author clinical practice guidelines also make the final documents available for free online. Simply type in your topic of interest mixed with the keyword guidelines and see what you find. A drawback of using a web search instead of UpToDate or DynaMed is that you will have to actively assess what you have found a bit more than if you are working from a curated list. But once you get comfortable with identifying clinical practice guidelines, this is a perfectly viable way to find them. Now that we have covered the way to find them, let's take a closer look at an example and see if we can identify the elements of a clinical practice guideline. I'm going to choose this one from the United States Preventive Services Task Force to look at closer. The USPSTF is one of the main groups that produce clinical practice guidelines in the U.S. And while they do call their documents final recommendation statements, they fully satisfy the criteria for clinical practice guidelines. To further illustrate this, let's take a look at the PDF format of this guideline, which is published in JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association. Thinking about our diagram from earlier, the authorship is listed as the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force. That definitely qualifies as a multidisciplinary group. Next, in the objective area, we can see that this document is updating an older recommendation, so we can be assured of its currency. In the objective, it also states that the USPSTF commissioned a systematic review on the topic to include the relative benefits versus harms of all the various screening strategies. Finally, in the evidence assessment and recommendations sections, the quality of the evidence was rated and the patient care recommendation was graded. This particular recommendation was given a grade of B. Of course, there will be more detail in the body of the document, but as you can see, a quick scan of the abstract can tell you if you have found a clinical practice guideline. If you have any questions about clinical practice guidelines or how to find them, please contact the library.